Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everybody out there in the ether, wherever you are listening to or watching us. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I direct the Center on the United States and Europe, and I am joined here by four of my distinguished colleagues for an event that we are calling Does the West's Ukraine Policy Need a Reality Check? Tomorrow, as you all know, is February 24th, the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. And compared to the buoyant atmosphere of the first anniversary in 2023, a year ago, when we all said the West is back, Ukraine will win, the mood has given way to a much gloomier, self-doubting atmosphere. And so we will be commemorating the second anniversary today by asking and hopefully answering some of the hardest questions about this war and the West's support for it. This is a collaboration between the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings, which I direct, and my colleague Michael O'Hanlon and his Strobe Talbott Center on security strategy and technology. Thank you again, Michael, for partnering with us as you do so often. It's always wonderful. And this discussion for the next hour is going to be based on a written debate that we published on February 15th with contributions by 6 colleagues, 4 of whom are with us. Asla Aydin-Bashtash, Michael Hanlon, Stephen Pfeiffer, and Angela Stent are with us today. Melanie Sisson and Tara Varma also contributed but can't be with us today. There is a link to the written debate on the webpage where you listeners or watchers signed up, and it is very much worth reading the written submissions. They're crisp, they're interesting, they're thoughtful, they're original. But of course, as I said, we published it on February 15th, and things have happened since then. Specifically, the death, some would say murder, of Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition leader. And so we will be swerving away a little from the written text and seeking to answer some of the new aspects, respond to the new aspects that have happened since then. For the next 40 minutes, what we're going to do is I will, as the moderator, be asking panelists to reflect on their responses. And for the last 15 minutes, we will be taking questions and answers from the audience. And viewers can submit those questions via social media using the hashtag #USEurope or by emailing events@brookings.edu. And fear not, we do actually get those and we do read them, and we will try and answer them, as many of them as we can. And some, in fact, were already sent in ahead of time. So thank you all for that. And I'm glad to welcome so many viewers to this. Let me start with our first question, which was, is Russia winning? Should the US and Europe push Ukraine to negotiate with Russia? And let me start here with my colleague, Stephen Pfeiffer, who's joining us from California and who is a former US ambassador to Kiev. Steve, you assert in your submission to this first question that Russia is not winning. Does that assessment still stand after the most recent Russian advances, especially the taking of Avdiivka? And I might add the killing, I think we would all agree, of Alexei Navalny, which, as I can attest from having attended the Munich Security Conference last weekend, had an absolutely chilling effect on the audience there.
Yeah, well, let me just first say that it was the murder of Alexei Navalny, and I think it really goes to the nature of this hideous regime in Moscow that after locking him away in the far north, they decided that they still had to murder him. But on your bigger question, yeah, I don't say at this point you cannot say that Ukraine is winning, but the narrative that seems to have taken hold over the last 3 months that now Russia is winning, I'm not sure that the reality bears that out. Today, in February 2024, Russia occupies only a bit more land of Ukraine than it did in February 2023, and much less than it occupied in the first half of 2022. And yes, the Russians won at Avdiivka. I would look back over the last year and say that the Russians have had 2 major ground victories, Bakhmut in spring of last year and Avdiivka a week ago. Both those towns were of relatively limited strategic importance, and it looks like the Russians paid tens of thousands of lives to take each one. So I'm not sure that this idea that Russia is now on the roll is going to bear out. a big question will be is now that the Ukrainians, I think, have largely gone over to the defensive, are the Russians able to exploit any of these wins, this win last week? We'll have to see that. Of course, a big question there is whether they get the weapons and the ammunition that they need from the West to sustain the fight.
Thank you very much, Steve. Point well taken. And that is the perfect lead over to Angela Stent, our colleague in Washington, D.C. Angela, given that US funding is at risk right now, continued US funding throughout the presidential election for Ukraine, that allies are visibly struggling to supply Ukraine with ammunition, and what I think we will all agree is the somewhat limited impact of sanctions, what leverage does the West actually have now to constrain Russia?
Unfortunately, our leverage is quite limited. I mean, new sanctions have been announced just today by the US, by the EU yesterday against individuals who are involved with Navalny's death and against corporations. But as we've seen, sanctions, as you said, have a limited impact. The kind of leverage that we should be using really has to do with the Russian oil and gas sector. We know that a lot of countries are helping Russia avoid these sanctions. We should really lean heavily on these countries like Turkey, China, other countries, and try, although it's very challenging, to get some agreement that they shouldn't be facilitating this. And another source of leverage we have really is our own LNG exports. The Biden administration has now put a stop on new LNG exports in a few years. We would like the Europeans, or we should want the Europeans, to buy more of our LNG so that they're not buying Russian LNG. So I think there are things in the energy sector that would make it more difficult for Russia to reap all these windfall profits. They're still reaping from the sale of hydrocarbons. So I think that's one thing where we could be doing more than we can. But I think otherwise it's limited our leverage. We obviously can't stop the North Koreans or the Iranians from selling Russia either ammunition or drones. But we should, I think, focus more on what we can do in the economic sector.
Right, and that is a not unimportant reference, of course, to the fact that some European nations are still importing Russian gas and oil. But let me ask you something, a follow-up question, which is something I said I wouldn't do, but I think here it is important. Am I right that I'm not hearing you suggest that the West should use the confiscated Russian central bank assets to help finance Ukrainian arms and ammunition?
No. If I didn't talk about that, it's just that I didn't mention it. I mean, I think we should at least be using the interest from these, confiscated Russian assets. I think the question of using all of them is more controversial, clearly, because there are people who think it sets legal precedents that then could redound against us and the Europeans. So I think that's a question where we probably do have to have more discussion. But I think, yes, we should be using the interest on this. But most of that money's in Europe, not in the US.
Which is also why there's disagreement between American and European supporters of Ukraine on this. I confess my own feelings are mixed here. Michael O'Hanlon, you write that Putin hopes to fracture Western political will and deplete Ukrainian manpower. How do you persuade the Kremlin that that isn't possible, given the limitations I just listed? Mike, Mike.
Constanze, it's a privilege to be with you and everybody else. And thank you for your voice of strategic and moral clarity throughout this debate. I think from the get-go, you've been a person who recognizes the stakes for not just Ukraine, but for Europe and the West and the world. And so thank you.
Buttering up the moderator will not get you anywhere.
We'll see. But I would say that in response to the question, that I think what we need to do to convince Russia that we are going to be behind Ukraine indefinitely is to keep the spigot open, to open it back up now, give Ukraine a chance over the next 12 to 18 months to see if it can, against the odds, be successful in a future counteroffensive. And I'm skeptical, but I think Ukraine deserves the chance to, at least for a while, try to reach that decision on its own. But start talking with Ukraine about what could be a fallback strategy, which is essentially a defensive strategy to make sure they hold on to what they've got today and also be anchored in one way or another to the West in security terms. And if Russia sees this dialogue happening and sees the aid flowing, then I think Russia is going to have a hard time believing that it can really win, unless, of course, Donald Trump is elected president, in which case all bets are off, given Trump's views on this conflict. So I'm afraid we can't completely put the issue to rest, as I'm guessing most of us would agree, until we see what happens with the congressional debate this year on U.S. aid and then the November elections. And if Trump wins, to see if he really would pull the rug out entirely from under Ukraine's feet, or if he would look for some kind of a negotiated settlement, as he's claimed at certain times. But Russia needs to see that Ukraine's military and economic assistance are viable enough that Russia is not going to be able to launch a major offensive of its own and not going to be able to outweigh us. So I think, again, the first step is to get the aid package through now. The second step is to start trying to persuade Donald Trump that if he wins, that we need to go for perhaps a solution that may end the fighting on terms that are less than perfect for Ukraine, but that do not abandon Ukraine by any stretch of the imagination. And I still hope that Trump may be persuadable on that front. I don't want to make it all about him, but that's a big piece of the puzzle. And I'm sure that's a big piece of Vladimir Putin's long-term hopes for winning this war, thinking that Trump might be his key to success.
Okay, quick follow-up. Are you concerned at all that Russia might have the ability to deal some kind of a crippling blow to Ukrainian morale, and that would paralyze Western support?
No, to be honest, although Steve Pfeiffer and others are more equipped to really speak to the Ukrainian polity and mentality. I've only been to Ukraine 3 times in my life, most recently in September, but I was nonetheless struck by the resoluteness. And the fact that there are some debates that President Zelensky replaced his general, that he and the mayor of Kyiv don't necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of things, that there is political churn in Ukraine. That's what's supposed to happen in a democracy when faced with a tough issue. So I look at Ukraine's politics today and I see healthy debate on a very tough, even existential issue, with Zelensky still commanding popularity pushing 80%. So I see Ukrainian toughness. I'd be curious if Steve and others agree, but that's what it looks like to me.
All right, thank you very much. But let me move to Aslı Aydınbaştaş, our fourth panelist. Aslı, you write, I think quite compellingly in your contribution to this first question, that we should not think in binaries, fighting versus negotiating, but seek compromise solutions. But tell me, how do you persuade Ukrainians to accept that, given the horrific crimes that the Russians have committed in the areas that they've occupied, which supposedly are areas that house Russian-speaking ethnic communities? How do you make that case? I would really like to understand that.
Look, I think this is not a binary choice that we have between forcing Ukraine to capitulate and continuing to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. It's everything in between. That is everything in between, involving ceasefires and half measures. That is how this war will end. I think that right now, the situation on the battlefield tells us that the wind is not in Ukraine's sails, quite the other way. The momentum has shifted decisively against Ukraine. That requires rethinking in terms of what a victory is. We need to be willing to redefine a Ukrainian victory among allies, but also encourage Ukraine to redefine what a Ukrainian victory is. As it is, liberation of all territory, of all the internationally recognized territory that Ukraine has, including Crimea and Donbass, does not really seem achievable, not at the level of support we are providing Ukraine. And I'm more pessimistic than others in this call in terms of our ability to sustain even that support, whether the supplemental passes or not. I think that American public and society and politicians are telling us that the support levels at this level is not going to be easily sustained. So a new definition of victory, which is a Ukraine that emerges out of this as a strong, sustainable, and sovereign country, preferably a democracy and preferably embedded in Euro-Atlantic institutions, including the EU, is the definition that we need to be seeking, and we need to encourage Ukrainians to embrace. That may, of course, involve tragically continued de facto control of some Ukraine territory, including Crimea, for foreseeable future. But I am not sure that there are other options here. I think the situation on the ground and our slow response in terms of stepping up military production tells us that Russians can make further gains. It is for the first time this year that people have started talking about Russia winning in some fashion or another. Not winning, of course, as in controlling all of Ukraine, but making greater gains. And I think that is far more problematic. So we do need to start thinking of a new definition for Ukrainian victory.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just add one more sentence. The idea is creating a Ukraine, a type of Ukraine, a strong, sustainable, sovereign Ukraine, where people in Russia, people in Donbass, people in Crimea will envy, hopefully in some fashion, whereby the fighting phase is over and we can get to that.
All right, thank you, Asli. I'm very glad we teased out some genuine disagreement. I think that's really important, and I'm grateful to you for it. And that actually is a perfect bridge to our second question, which was, how can the US and its allies ensure security and stability in Ukraine and Europe? And should Ukraine be given NATO membership at the Washington summit, especially given that the Europeans at the EU Council in December opened accession talks for EU membership? Let me start with you, Michael O'Hanlon. You've proposed with Lise Howard putting US and allied boots, including Indian and Chinese boots, on the ground in Ukraine, a peacekeeping force, in other words, something that has gone a little bit out of fashion recently internationally, and something that the NATO allies have categorically ruled out, including, importantly, the US. How do you change their minds? What's your elevator pitch? And it should be an elevator pitch. Mike, the mic.
Yes, Constanza, excellent question. The writing that Lise and I have done begins with the notion that Ukraine does have to be anchored to the West in security terms in some way, but that NATO membership may not be the best vehicle, especially if we are allowing for the possible long-term option of a negotiated end to this, given how much contempt Russia holds for the idea of Ukraine and NATO. So Lise and I have tried to develop an alternative concept that would, as you say, do two things. It would create a tripwire with Western forces on the ground, not as combat units, but as advisors, but yet in big enough numbers that Russia could not possibly think that it could attack and get away with it. And then secondly, to have a security architecture that someday in a post-Putin Russia could include Russia perhaps, but that in the shorter term would not, but it would include Ukraine. And this could happen actually fairly soon. And I would propose to the Russians, once we really are at a point where the Ukrainians seek a negotiation and we want to support them in that negotiation, we should say to Moscow, if you want to avoid the NATO option, you got to move fast with us on the negotiation over this other security architecture. Otherwise, NATO membership may be the inevitable fallback. So in a way, our option is designed to be potentially more conciliatory towards a future Moscow, but at the same time, to get Western boots on the ground, as you say, which is perhaps in some ways a more robust kind of security commitment than even Article 5 NATO membership might be. So you might say we're trying to thread the needle, and that could be a critique. I don't necessarily know how to make our idea happen by June, but I think having a toolkit of options where NATO membership is one of them, and another kind of security architecture, maybe a second type, it may be useful to frame things with that kind of a range of possibilities, since we can't yet really know how this war will end or whether negotiations will be part of it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Stephen Piper, you argue that NATO should initiate accession talks with Kiev at the Alliance's June summit in Washington, recognizing that there is no consensus in the alliance on offering membership to Ukraine in wartime. And as you know, both Berlin and the Biden administration are reluctant to do even that. and other allies may very well be hiding behind them. How do you overcome what I've called, if you'll forgive my quoting myself, the axis of prudence, the fear of escalation that Washington and Berlin and perhaps some other allies share?
Well, it seems to me that two things have become very clear over the past 2 years. One is that the United States and Europe cannot have a stable and secure Europe without a stable and secure Ukraine. And second, Ukraine by itself is going to be a temptation for Russia in the future. I think Mike's come up with a very interesting idea, but I'm not sure that you could get major Asian players, China and India, to participate. And without that kind of Asian participation, you're looking at Europe, it makes sense to me to just do NATO. It was pretty clear, I think, in Vilnius last summer that there was no consensus on offering Ukraine an invitation to join the alliance now. But there could be a different way. You could launch accession talks with the goal of getting to an early invitation. And I think that does three things. One, it's a morale booster. It's a positive message to Ukraine that you're now on a definitive track towards NATO membership. Second, it's also membership to Moscow that NATO's commitment to Ukraine will endure. And third, if you get to a negotiation at some place between Kyiv and Moscow, which I think at some time is going to happen, it actually, I believe, strengthens Ukraine's negotiating hand. Now, if I could take 30 seconds, I would like to come back to the notion of a ceasefire that also raised, which I think is one that's out there, which I very much disagree with, unless the Ukrainians want to pursue it. And right now, the Ukrainians are not interested in a ceasefire. But I see several drawbacks to the West pushing Ukraine to accept a ceasefire now. First, I see very little evidence that Moscow's interested in a ceasefire. Second, a ceasefire would allow the Russians an opportunity to regroup, rearm, and prepare to launch a new assault at a time of their choosing. And third, the history of ceasefire with Russians over the last 10 years has not been a good one. Every time there's been a ceasefire, Ukraine has never seen that land come back. So the 2014 ceasefire, the 2015 ceasefire, each time Russia's taken more of Ukraine's territory. And my fear is that if there was a ceasefire, it would basically be de facto acceptance by Ukraine that that territory now belongs to Russia. If the Ukrainians come to the conclusion that they have to accept that that should be their choice, the West, though, should not be pushing them to negotiate that kind of outcome.
All right, thank you, Steve. I will just say, though, that while, as you know, I think your suggestion of a sort of an organized path to NATO membership initiated at the Washington summit is reasonable and feasible. That also is something that Washington and Berlin are resisting, right? But I'm going to move over to Angela. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to avoid what happened in Vilnius last year.
Yeah, well, such is life, sadly. I think some of the participants of that push in Vilnius would now agree, and in fact have told me that was unhelpful. But sorry, we're not going to, you and I, engage in this bilaterally, not here at least. Angela, moving to you. You write that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a failure of deterrence. So we need to reestablish deterrence by A, continuing to support Ukraine, and for as long as Russian neo-imperialism continues, to, quote, redouble the containment strategy which worked during the Cold War, unquote. But, and here's my but, we can already see a guns versus butter debate taking hold on both sides of the Atlantic. So tell us, how should American and European leaders persuade their voters to skimp on butter so the government can buy more guns?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I think the European, or many European publics already understand that if Russia wins this war, their security is threatened. It's not going to stop there. And let me just say, you know, as long as Vladimir Putin or someone like him is in power, and it's quite possible that when he's no longer the president, someone who shares his view will be, that mentality, those Russians will want to take Ukraine. They believe that the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, was a geopolitical catastrophe, and they believe that Ukraine belongs to them. So all this talk of ceasefires and negotiations, it would just be temporary. I mean, it's when Ashley says, well, if you have a sovereign Ukraine and might prosper economically and be integrated in the West, yes, that's great. If Russia were to give up its goal of conquering Ukraine, but it's not clear that it's going to do that for the foreseeable future. So I think we have to be very realistic about this. And you know, I think you have to just persuade people in Europe and in the US, and obviously with the Trump wing of the Republican Party, it's apparently they don't want to listen to this. But Europe's future security is threatened. The European countries, you know, have to spend more on defense. Some of them are. Poland is. Germany, obviously, you were at Munich. There's still big debates about that. Maybe Germany will finally be spending, you know, its 2% or more on defense. Other countries, that's part of the deterrence, making the Russians believe that European countries are serious about that. And then in the US, again, persuading the public that if Russia wins and if Europe's security is more threatened by this, and if Russia has other aggressive ambitions in Europe, in the end, the US will have to come back to Europe, as it did twice in the 20th century, to make sure that, you know, Western security is guaranteed and that we are not overrun by authoritarian powers. I know it's not an easy case to make, and in a time of inflation and war weariness in some parts of Europe, and there isn't much war weariness in Ukraine, it's going to be difficult to make, but you just have to keep arguing this and persuading the public. But that requires leadership from both European leaders and US leaders, and some of that is weaker than it was before. And let me just say one other thing. I do not agree with Asli that the war has shifted decisively in Russia's favor. Yes, Russia has made some territorial gains, and Putin is giving the impression that Russia is winning, and it's more difficult for Ukraine. But if US assistance comes through, and I realize that's a big if, and if the Europeans continue to support Ukraine, I don't think we should be so defeatist. As you said, Constanza, a year ago, there was this, people were almost euphoric that Ukraine had done so well. Now I think there's excessive pessimism about what's happening. And when I talk to military experts here, they say that Ukraine does still have a chance if it's more on the defensive this year, if it regroups, but it could do better next year.
All right, thank you. I will say there's a new German survey out, the Politbarometer, one of the two authoritative monthly surveys that the big TV stations do each month, and that has 62% of respondents saying that the German government should give Ukraine more arms and ammunitions, which is a lot more forward-leaning than the government currently is, it has to be said. Asli, you are... I'm really grateful to you playing the role of provocateur here, because I think it's really very important, and especially since the whole purpose of this discussion is to poke at the hard questions and not to give easy answers. So I have a question for you about your own country, whose role in this conflict is very important, but I think not taken seriously enough by many observers. And as you know, Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has notably balanced his country's NATO membership with his desire for a peer-to-peer relationship with Putin's Russia. And he's also pitched himself as a diplomatic mediator between Kyiv and Moscow. Has his, do you think, assessment of Russian strategic intentions towards Ukraine and Europe and the implications for Turkey changed over the past 2 years, in your observation? And do you think he would find a Russian sphere of influence in Europe acceptable? Would that be in line with Turkish strategic purposes?
Thank you, Constanza. Allow me to sort of touch upon this idea of what Angela and Steve has raised, and then I'll get to Turkey. I think that our webinar is called A Reality Check. And it's important to remember that a year from now, there is the possibility that there will be a government here in Washington that effectively forces Ukraine to enter negotiations, if not force, really strongly encourage. And I think that we cannot overlook the fact that there is the danger that Ukraine would be forced to think of peace on Russia's terms, which is not a good idea for European security, not a good idea for Ukraine and NATO. So I think that is important that we start having this conversation of what the end game is here, starting to craft a new version of Ukrainian victory so that we are not faced with this situation in which Ukraine is. forced to entertain the idea of peace on Russia's terms. I think that long war, another point where I differ from maybe Angela, is that a long war I don't think favors Ukraine. I think a long war is something whereby Russia can overwhelm Ukraine using the sort of methods it has used, using human waves, using the unspeakable level of distraction on civilian centers. But nonetheless, a long war would exhaust Ukraine, but also create the prospect of a ceasefire later on Russia's terms. And of course, you know, there is the impact this is having on the global South. We've seen the level of propaganda, the effectiveness of Russian propaganda in countries like Brazil, Turkey.
I want to come back to that shortly.
So I skipped that point. This is about cautioning in terms of long war, reduction of fighting in one form or another in the form of a ceasefire is one where we can bring Western strengths to bear. That is to say, you know, allow for the emergence of a new Ukraine, reconstruction, reform, democracy. These are our strengths that are in peacetime. Not so much in war.
You've made your point on this, and I think it's in its own terms compelling, which is that the faster we can support Ukraine, the faster we can push for a resolution, the better this is for Ukraine. I get that, but do tell us. I genuinely want to know whether Turkey's take on this conflict has changed over the past 2 years. That would be helpful for all of us.
Look, I think Turks have fought Russia for the last 3 centuries. They understand what Russia is. Nobody has any love lost for the type of regime and military power Putin is trying to spread around the world. If nothing, we have seen what he has been capable of doing in Syria, destroying major civilizational centers in a war that has led to 600 to 800,000 civilians dying. It's not that people have any notion of Russia wanting peace or stability in the region. I think it's skepticism that the West is going to be able to prevail in this war that seems to have pushed countries like Turkey and I would say, you know, India, Indonesia, and so on into a situation whereby they are showing more realpolitik. Turkey's best interests are not in Russia controlling the Black Sea or Ukraine. Their best interests, strategic interests, are for Ukraine to survive as a sovereign nation on the Black Sea. There's no doubt about that. And I think Erdogan and everyone else understands that. I think their skepticism is about Western resolve and Ukraine's ability to win at the end of the war.
Okay, actually, I'm going to stay with you, but I'm moving into our third complex of questions. And thank you everyone for being so disciplined, because we're sort of ticking along nicely, given the time. That's very kind of you. Our third question was, in the written debate, how can Ukraine's defeat be prevented, and what would be the consequences of Russian victory for NATO? And Aslı, you did write there that and you've just repeated that now, that Russian victory would have a disastrous impact on European security, and with ripple effects even to parts of the Middle East. And you've written and just mentioned the Global South reservations with regard to Western attempts to claim their solidarity. But again, I think we all know by now that non-Western powers don't view the prospect of a Russian victory with equanimity or indifference. So what do you think, what actions by Putin do you think would actually induce them to distance themselves from him?
I think countries are fully aware of what Russia is. What is important here is to have more clarity in terms of what the end game is from a Western perspective. I think a Russian victory would be devastating, not just for European security, but also would have ripple effects on countries on the periphery of Russia, including Armenia, including Moldova, including Georgia, including countries like Turkey and parts of the Middle East. So this is not a desirable outcome for anyone. I think we're all aware of that. But how we prevent that and sort of push back against Russia in a way that creates permanent structures, I think people have different ideas. One idea that has emerged in Turkey and in the global south is the way you prevent Russian imperialism is by striking some type of a ceasefire in Ukraine, whether it's in the form of providing security guarantees, a partial NATO membership, and so on. But the whole idea of security guarantees or a security assistance for Ukraine should be part of this end game. It could be what Steve has mentioned, sort of some type of an accession process for NATO. It could be, some of the great ideas Michael has put forth. It could be bilateral security arrangements. But I think the global south does want this highly destabilizing war to end in Russia. I think, I want to disrupt you of the notion that people have a romantic view of Vladimir Putin or Russia. I think everyone
that's an important point.
What this regime is all about. And if anyone had any misgivings, this week was enough of a proof in terms of what they're capable of doing. And we know that from Grozny, we know that from Aleppo, and we know that already from Mariupol.
And so many murders of Russian opposition leaders, from Elena Politkovskaya and to the pilot who defected and went to ground in Spain and was apparently tracked by Russian intelligence and murdered. Right. So yes, thank you for that point, Asli. I think that was really important. Mike, at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, U.S. Senator and Trump ally, possibly vice presidential hopeful, J.D. Vance argued very strongly that the Europeans needed to rid themselves of their dependency on the U.S. The Trump camp, of course, as we know, is notoriously skeptical of NATO. How do you make the case to Senator Vance that NATO is useful even to a Trump or Trumpist administration?
Constanza, I guess I begin with two things. One is the reality of just how much Ukraine has been helped by Europe, even more than it's been helped by the United States in the last 2 years or even last 10 years. So this is real world burden sharing. It may not mean that Europe does what it should on regular defense spending, and there's still a long ways to go, as you and I agree on that. But what Europe's done historically and in recent times to help Ukraine is very noteworthy, very impressive, and fully already Ukraine is benefiting from European help even more than from American help. But both pillars are required. So again, I hope Congress passes this aid package very soon. The other argument I would make is based on history. And obviously you and I and everyone else on this panel and many others have wrestled with the lessons of the last 100+ years of European security relations. And when I look, whether I look at a historical or a theoretical perspective, when I see Europe with 4, 5, 6 relatively comparably strong powers, that's often been a recipe for conflict in the world wars and before the world wars, whereas the United States, with its role in NATO, really undergirds the alliance with not just military heft, but being sort of first among equals in terms of size, scale, political clout, economic clout. I think the Western alliance works best that way. And if we leave it to Europe, which means, of course, Germany, Britain, France, Poland, Italy, Spain, all sort of expecting to play big roles, others hoping to play almost as big roles. You understand European security dynamics better than I do, but it looks to me that European allies are the best allies we could ask for, as long as we don't ask them to do it all on their own, because there is no natural leader, especially with Angela Merkel gone in your country. But even then, it would be hard to say how any one country could lead when Britain's not in the EU, when different countries worry more about the southern border of Europe than about the eastern border. So I think only the United States provides that strategic glue and leadership. And if we want to avoid World War III, therefore, the United States should stay engaged in Europe in a way that it did not prior to 1914 or 1939. That's the best I can do in an argument.
Okay, let me, because I don't have any questions here yet from the audience, I do want to move to the others, but quick question: do you see any role for Europe, for European allies in any conflict, military or non-military, with China?
That's a good question. I think that the more important role would be economic punishment. I think any war pitting the United States and Taiwan, for example, against China would become a multidimensional war, and it would make the kind of economic sanctions that we're imposing on Russia look relatively minor by comparison to the disruption to the world economy and the way in which I think we would have to try to punish China economically while making ourselves resilient against China's inevitable economic punishment of us. So that's the realm in which I think Europe has the greatest role to play. It would be nice to have a few European destroyers help break a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, but I'm not counting on it. And I don't know that it's worth the effort to try to get 1 or 2 or 3 more destroyers in the mix when there's so much to do on the economic side in terms of both deterrence and resilience.
Yeah, but thank you for clarifying the economic point, which I think is important and is one that I think would be worth making to Senator Vance. Steve Pfeiffer, let me move to you. Our colleague Melanie Sisson, who wasn't able to join us in this debate, but has been I think sort of one of the most trenchant skeptics in our written debate, which is why, again, I encourage everybody on this call to go back and look at our written exchanges. Our colleague Melanie Sisson suggests that the US and Europe need to shape Russia's incentive to negotiate. And she offers the following as incentives: calibrated sanctions relief, clarity that Ukraine will not be a NATO member, and thirdly, signals that Russia will be a part of the continent's future security architecture. Isn't she right? And note to everybody here, not just in the 4 of you, but everybody else who's listening, I'm quoting my colleague here.
Yeah, I disagree. Let me first just second Mike's point about Europe, because I don't think this is well understood in America. If you sum up military, financial, humanitarian commitments to Ukraine, Europe has now committed twice what the United States has. But coming back to your point, no, I disagree with what Melanie has suggested, because it basically leaves Ukraine open to a new Russian assault. Ukraine by itself, I mean, there was the agreement at Vilnius for these G7 security commitments, which now Germany, France, Denmark, Britain have negotiated these things. There are agreements to provide assistance, but nobody's saying we will send our troops to defend you. That's what NATO brings. And again, Ukraine left by itself is going to be this temptation. We're setting ourselves up for a new conflict at some point in the future. And I think we ought to worry about that. And we ought to worry about also what happens should Russia win this war. And that's where I think that there needs to be a focus on NATO, that there is a threat. A lot of analysts say, Russia would never invade a NATO country, would never talk about invading a Baltic state. But go back 5 years ago, nobody would have predicted what the Russians did in February of 2022 with a full-scale invasion. And so, anchoring Ukraine in a way in the security structure that bolsters Europe's defense, I think, is the way to go. And talking about a security structure with Russia now seems to me just to be it's a fantasy. The European security, I mean, there was a security structure developed over 30 years that brought Russia in. Russia, by its actions, has absolutely shredded that structure. So the security structure that Europe needs now is going to be one that's designed to deter, contain, and defend against Russia. At some future point, when Russia changes, when Russia's prepared to live in peace with its neighbors, then maybe you can bring a structure that brings Russia in. But that's a long way down the road. And I think we need to be realistic about that, as much as it's not a happy prospect.
Right. I think it's only fair to say, though, that if reports are correct and the things that one was hearing and I was hearing at the Munich Security Conference, what Melanie Sisson outlines here is a tempting lineup to a not insignificant number of members of the alliance, simply because I think they're so worried about their ability to provide unlimited support for Ukraine over a long stretch of time, or ramp up with the speed that would be required to help Ukraine tip the scales, as Asla has suggested, right? Those two things appear, I think, to many Western leaders to be currently beyond their grasp. And again, Steve, I'm trying to here is to pinpoint the disagreements. I am not taking sides. In fact, a lot of you know what side I'm on in this argument. But let me move to Angela Stent, and we can come back to this, Steve, if I may. But I do.
Seconds.
Yes, please.
I think you're correct in 2024. 2024 is going to be a difficult year. But if you look at projections for 2025, I think the West's ability will have been ramped up. So, for example, between Europe and America in 2025, production capabilities of maybe 2.5 million artillery shells per year. 2025, things can change.
All right. Well, fingers crossed for 2025, at which time we will have a new presidential administration in the United States. Angela, you are our last speaker in the last round of these questions, and then I do have some questions that have come in online. But you write in your submission that a Russian victory could shake NATO to the core, quote unquote, not just because Russia might set its sights on the Baltics of Poland, but because it might deepen existing fissures in Europe, making other states inclined to become more accommodationist towards Moscow. I do think that's something that is an aspect of current European security debates that is under-examined. And so it's also a source of real political vulnerability, right? That could be exploited by adversaries, not least the Russians. So do you have, given particularly what Steve and Mike have indicated, that really it is not just historically the role of the United States to be the, shall we say, the unifier of the continent who occasionally knocks heads together or takes away the fear of France or Germany dominating. How do you have a recommendation, Angela, of how to address these fissures, especially if the US begins to lean away from supporting Ukraine?
So I think it would be very important for the United States to play a major role. I mean, what I wrote is countries like Hungary, obviously, Slovakia, Italy, Spain. I mean, there are a number of countries in Europe that are already, fiercely debating whether they should be supporting Ukraine. And I think in the event of a Russian victory would be quite sanguine about accommodating Russia and going really back to a stance that they had before Russia invaded Ukraine. Whereas, we'd like to think that a Russian victory would unite the Western alliance. I think it's quite possible that it would do exactly the opposite. And then we'd really be in a much more difficult situation. So, I mean, my recommendation here is, and listening to what my colleagues have said also, is it's the US that has to remain very much involved there and to try and persuade the more recalcitrant members of NATO to rethink in the event of a Russian victory, how they would arrange their relationship with Russia. I just want to point out, if we are having a reality check, and that's the name of this webinar, Russia has no interest in negotiations at the moment. It's not interested in a ceasefire. As Putin told Tucker Carlson, they still need to denazify Ukraine. That means changing the regime in Ukraine and having a country that's really subordinate to Russia. So we should have no illusions. We keep talking about, should we put pressure on the Ukrainians to sit down with the Russians? First of all, Putin is not going to sit down with Zelensky. He would only want to sit down with the United States. But beyond that, they really don't have any interest in any kind of ceasefire or negotiation because they think that they are winning now. So I think we just have to, accept that as we go forward with our discussions. But I do think that the only way to prevent the alliance in the event of a Russian victory from splintering would be for a larger US role. And clearly, if Donald Trump becomes president in November, I don't see that happening.
So, Angela, in sum, what you're saying is that our colleague Melanie Sisson's suggestions of sanctions relief, excluding the Ukrainian NATO membership, and signals that Russia will be part of Europe's security architecture are, as it were, realist transactionalist incentives that would not move a Russia that has a completely different take on this conflict. Right, as something that is much more existential for itself and, in fact, for Putin's regime, correct? Your mic is off.
Russia didn't invade Ukraine because of NATO. I know that's a big discussion. It's controversial, but it didn't. It invaded Ukraine because Putin and the people around him, and many in the Russian elite, believe that Ukraine is not a separate country and that it belongs to Russia. And they rue the fall of the Soviet Union, and they want to reestablish Russia as a great power, as it was in the Soviet times. And all of these other things are kind of incidental. And I think they fail to appreciate the mentality in the Kremlin.
All right. Thank you very, very much. I do sort of worry, honestly, that part of our discussion sort of revolves around, or sort of our recommendations end in, but we should do the things that currently people are not doing, right? Rather than saying this is how we get them to stop not doing them, right? And but I will just, that we can perhaps keep that for consideration. And as you have all said, I think we all agree this war is not going to be over soon, and it might be something that I think we could do more in-depth work on. But let me move to some of the questions that we've gotten online. They are not addressed to anything in particular, but I will lob them at one of you. The first one comes from former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin, who I think is known to many of you. He wants to know, what is our definition of Russian strategic defeat? And I'll leave it at that. And in fact, let me perhaps lob that at Steve Pfeiffer first, and let's see whether anybody else wants to take a stab at it as well. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, my definition of defeat of Russia in this war is we get to a point where the Russian military or the Ukrainian military either pushes the Russian military completely out of Ukraine or achieves enough success on the battlefield that it can negotiate a settlement on terms acceptable to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people.
All right. Angela, Mike, Aslan, would you like to add your...
I mean, I think ultimately I agree with Steve, but it's ultimately Russia accepting that Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country with the right to choose which alliances it belongs to if they want Ukraine. And it gives up the idea that Ukraine and Russia have to be united. I think that would be the definition.
If I could, I would just add that I like very much what Steve and Angela just said, more like the goal of declaring that Russia must suffer strategic defeat. It strikes me that even though we all know what we mean when we say that, it could be one of these unnecessarily inflammatory concepts. So I would personally not frame things in those terms. I would use the more positive terms that Steve and Angela used about Ukraine's future being assured.
All right.
Can I jump in? Agreeing with Mike here, I think Russia's strategic defeat is the emergence of a strong Ukraine as a sovereign state, preferably a European democracy. And that is perhaps the only way to put an end to Russian imperialism that will also continue to challenge democracies or sovereign states on Russia's periphery, including some of those that I mentioned, but also Bosnia and definitely Caucasus. All right, let me move to another question asked both by Pavlo Klimkin and by Mr. Guimarães de Souza, whom I don't know, forgive me, and that is the role of China here. I think we all remember that when Olaf Scholz went to Beijing in early December 2022, he was very pleased, to put it carefully, that Xi Jinping said next to him and in public that the Chinese really, really didn't want to see nuclear escalation in Ukraine. And there is, correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is that Russian nuclear threats have been somewhat reduced since then, and that the Russians have also stopped shooting up the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia. But on the other hand, the Chinese have been quietly or less quietly supportive of the Russian cause in international fora, and
perhaps even done more than that. Perhaps somebody would like to comment on the role of China here, maybe Angela?
Thank you. Yes, the Chinese, I mean, that statement by Xi Jinping when Chancellor Scholz was there was important. And then Putin's nuclear rhetoric has been rather quiet. But Medvedev, right? Dmitry Medvedev, the once thought of as a liberal president, and other Russian political commentators do talk about the nuclear rhetoric, and some of the people that we used to know as colleagues in Russia, the pundits, are still advocating, annihilating London or Berlin or whatever it is. But Putin himself, has toned down the rhetoric, but there is enough of an undercurrent of discussion there to keep everyone on their toes, and I think to reinforce the fear, the White House, or the concern in the White House about escalation. The Chinese really are supporting the Russians. We know that they're helping evade some of the sanctions, that they're supplying Russia with components that are being used both in weapons and in other industrial fora. They keep reiterating their close ties with Russia. And I think we have to understand that Xi Jinping does not want Russia to be defeated in this war because there would be many repercussions, nor does he want a leader coming to power in Moscow who would rethink what Russia's foreign policy was and maybe try to repair ties with the West. The Chinese have really done very little to mediate. I know there was hope in Europe in the beginning that they could be mediators in this conflict. They did send a representative to Ukraine, but they've pulled back from that now. They didn't attend the last couple of summits, including the one in Davos on the Ukrainian peace plan. So I see them as, at least passive supporters of Russia, and concerned about what would happen if Russia were defeated.
Constanza, could I add a brief word?
If you can make it a minute or less, because I am going to have
30
to wrap
seconds. 30 seconds. Yeah. I agree with Angela, but I would also say it's very important that China has not shipped weapons to Moscow. That's a very important strategic fact. Also, there are elements of the Chinese quote unquote peace plan that we can live with and should try to work with. So China's helping Russia less than we're helping Ukraine, which is, of course, not to praise Beijing, but just to observe that distinction.
Right. All right. I will perhaps counter that with the fact, the pointing out that we're seeing for the first time in post-fall of the wall, post-Cold War history, something of a de facto alignment of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran on supporting, on fighting Ukraine and resisting Western support, which I think ought to concern us more in terms of global stability as a development. But I will leave it here. I'm really glad that we managed to tease out so many disagreements. I think that is wonderful. And that was the purpose of this discussion and conversation. I'm grateful to Stephen Piver, Angela Stent, Michael Hanlon, Asli Aydin-Bashtash for joining us. And I'm sorry that Melanie Sisson and Tara Barmer weren't able to do so as well. But do read all of their submissions in the written debate. And I would also say all of the writers here on screen have written pieces around this second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You can find links to all of them in the Center on the United States' newsletter, the second newsletter which is just out and which you can sign up from. Steve Piver has written a very useful explainer of Ukraine aid supplemental's fate in Congress. Angela Stent wrote a recollection of Alexei Navalny. Michael Hanlon has written an update of our joint collaborative effort, the Ukraine Index, an update for the Washington Post. You can also find a link to that. Asli has written multiple pieces about Turkey and the Middle East and its connections to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And finally, I also want to recommend to you, I think, a deeply moving piece by our non-resident fellow Mariana Bujerin, where she, who is Ukrainian in origin, where she reflects on her life as a Ukrainian in the diaspora and her take on the Revolution of Dignity 10 years ago and its anniversary today. I really recommend that you read that on this anniversary. And again, thank you to everybody, and thank you for tolerating me, Constanze Stetzenmüller, as your moderator, as always. Thanks to everyone who joined.